Okie Well, hello there. More distant that. So in making my usual preparations, I came across some other stuff. One of which is so there's this guy. I think he's an assistant professor of English at sort of the degree he has from University of California, Davis, but his undergraduate degree is in computer science. So he's a bit of a gadfly, the usual kind of gadfly. He's from India, as you may notice, Ranjad Singh Dalawal. Dalawal. And anyway, there's this new translation of Karl Marx's Capital done by these two guys, and it there really isn't a pre-release. So you can read the first chapter, and I'll show you that in a second. So the first chapter is available off the Princeton University Press website. But this guy was just screwing around and decided that he would play with the language. So this is not what's in the book, but he's just messing about with what the internet says are terms that your teenager should know. You know, the sort of TikTok coding language. The labor is now more accurately described as the wannabe Sigma, and his labor power is Riz. This is vital because it denaturalizes the surplus value extraction under capitalism. The Riz is there, as in charisma, is there to be deployed, rizzing up, and not merely ontological, that is, having Riz. It's also worth noting that the chapter on machinery and large-scale industry is now refracted through a reading of the Gaiat and explanation below. I reckon this will have important implications for the folks working on the libidinal economy. There's lots of, sort of postmodern, post-structuralist joking going on here. And finally, the translators hint at how, in light of these revisions, the specter haunting Europe is more precisely rendered as skibbity toilet. It may be scary, but it's also been irreverently cast aside by capitalists for centuries now, a critical change for hauntologists. So there's a lot of meta going on. So sigma, what is this sigma? It's not just the 18th letter of the Greek alphabet, but it's also teen slang for a cool dude. According to Know Your Meme, sigma is referring to a supposed classification for men who are successful and popular, but also silent and rebellious. Sigma males, as opposed, I assume, to alpha and beta males, are considered equal to alphas on the hierarchy, but live outside of the hierarchy by choice, reads the website. So I assume this is some sort of hipster deal. Urban Dictionary adds that sigma is what all 10-year-olds think they are. Huh. As reported by British GQ, the word sigma was born from the misogynistic manosphere. And what does Riz mean? Riz is a slang term for skill in charming or seducing a potential romantic partner, especially through verbal communication. Lest you think this doesn't exist, there's entire culture of this sort of, that's though there's rhetorical strategies for seducing, for men seducing women. This is a very cisgender sort of deal. It's most commonly applied in the context of men pursuing women, but not always. It is typically used in the exact same way as the older slang term game, that is to have game. Dan's not all that good looking. This is an example, but he's got serious riz. Look at him charming those two models. The related term unspoken riz refers to the ability to exude charm or charisma without verbal communication, such as with general confidence and body language. Riz is also used as a verb, often in the form riz up, meaning to charm someone. For example, I'm about to riz up Sarah. You know if she has a boyfriend. And so whether you saw it on TikTok or witnessed a Twitch chat spam it into oblivion, the slang term gyat or gaiat almost always written in all caps, is almost always said after a pretty lady walks by. This is all male discourse. It seems like all the guys know what it means, and even if they don't, they understand the instinct to pause a video and shout, "Yeah," or just like your age and Kai's Senate do. Gaia is basically the short way of saying "God damn," and even though this abbreviation has been used in small dose since 2009. I think doses, I think is what it means. It wasn't until this year, 2022, that it took over some parts of the internet. So where did Gaia come from and how is it used in memes today? In January 2012, female hip-hop artist and meme icon Nicki Minaj was the first to gain over 100 likes for a tweet using "God damn." 2 years later, in January 2014, she posted a tweet that earned over 1,000 likes. In fact, many tweets using "God damn" as an expression surfaced in 2014, with most of them referencing Miss Minaj. She is likely precursor for the slang's 2021 resurgence. And then finally, Skibbity Toilet and who created it. Skibbity Toilet is an animated video series created by Georgian animator Alexei Gerasimov. Installments are posted as YouTube shorts and later compiled into longer videos on Gerasimov's channel, The Fuck Boom. The series is animated using computer graphics and falls into a film subgenre called machinima, a portmanteau of machine and cinema. The plot generally depicts a dystopian world in which skibbity toilets, mobile toilets with human heads popping out of their bowls, are at war with humanoids who have speakers, cameras, and TVs for heads. The features of the most human-like characters are distorted and often warped in disconcerting and violent ways. It's pretty much first-person shooter point of view, which may make it difficult to watch for some viewers. In total, the series has more than 72 episodes, with some uploaded in multiple parts. The first Skibbity Toilet video was posted on February 7, 2023, and has more than 164 million views. But other videos in this series have more than 250 million views. The Fuck Boom channel now has 41 million YouTube subscribers and over 16 billion views. It just makes me feel old, but I included a video thing. I won't show it. It's just it's sort of a, well, it is absurd. And the term is more, this paragraph's more interesting. The term skibbity toilet syndrome refers to a belief expressed across social media that the series is harmful to children and negatively affects their behavior and development. The Guardian called it a moral panic, but parents on Reddit is an oxymoron, have reported that the series has made their children fearful of using the toilet. These posts indicate that young children may be especially vulnerable and confused by the content. Gee. Anyway, you can look at that at your leisure. More interesting, of course, is this little bit, and the original kind of the source of the issue. That is, there's a new thing that's going to come out in about 2 weeks. A new version, new translation of Karl Marx's Capital, translated by Paul Ryder and edited by Paul North and Paul Ryder. One at Ohio State, the other one at Yale. And this is what it looks like. It'll have, well, it's the first one in 50 years. So, we'll see whether people trash it or not. I think they've sucked up to most of the people who would have an opinion on it, like Heinrich, etc. So I think there'll be generally favorable comments on it. And I propose in some ways that we might read through this particular version of it, but we'll see. Since we're about the time we've almost turned over, we're up through volume 2 of Capital, and it doesn't really hurt to start it over again, especially if there's the new translation might be a little more easier to read. And on the publisher's website, Princeton University Press, there is a sample chapter. Fortunately, the first chapter, and not the whole chapter, but enough of it so that we could just read it here and sort of see how it sounds. And it's not going to sound that different, but it is interesting to see that, it smooths over some of the 19th century constructions that have gotten sort of messed about by the various translations. So hopefully this is better for all concerned. The two factors of the commodity: use value and value, that is, value dash substance or magnitude of value. The wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of a quote unquote enormous accumulation of commodities. The individual commodity appears as the elementary form of that wealth. Hence, our investigation begins by analyzing the commodity. A commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing whose properties satisfy human wants or needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs and wants, whether they come from our belly or our imagination, doesn't matter here. It also doesn't matter how an object satisfies them, whether directly as a means of subsistence or enjoyment, or indirectly as the means to produce something else. Every useful thing, that is, iron, paper, etc., can be considered from two perspectives at once: quality and quantity. Since everything is a whole that combines many properties, it can be useful in different ways. Discovering these ways, and thus the diverse applications of a thing, is a historical act. So is the creation of a society's standards for measuring amounts of useful things. The standards of measurements for commodities differ in part because of the natural differences among the objects measured, in part by convention. The usefulness of a thing makes it into a use value. The usefulness, in this sense, doesn't hover above us in the air, determined by the properties of a commodity's body. It would not exist without them. Thus, a commodity's body, as with iron, wheat, diamonds, etc., is itself a use value or good. Whether or not it has this character doesn't depend on how much work or how little human beings have to do to appropriate its useful properties. When considering use values, we always suppose that we're dealing with definite amounts. For example, dozens of watches, yards of linen, tons of iron. The use values of commodities supply the material for an independent discipline, that is, commodity studies. Use value is realized only when something is used or consumed. Whatever social form wealth takes, use values make up its material content. Within the form of society that concerns us here, they also function as the material bearers of exchange value. Exchange value first appears as a quantitative relation, the ratio in which one type of use value is exchanged for another. This relation changes constantly, varying with time and place. Exchange value thus seems to be something accidental and purely relative, and the idea of exchange value is something inherent in valeur intrinsèque, or immanent to a commodity, seems to be a contradictio in adjecto. But let's just take a closer look. A single commodity, say 8 bushels of wheat, can be traded for other goods in the most diverse ratios of exchange. But the wheat's exchange value remains the same, whether it's expressed as this much boot polish, that much silk, this much gold, or something else. Its exchange value then must have a content that can be distinguished from these different modes of expression. Let's now consider two commodities, for instance, wheat and iron. Whatever their relation of exchange may be, it can always be represented as an equation in which some quantity of wheat equals some quantity of iron. 8 bushels of wheat, for example, equals 100 pounds of iron. What does this equation say? that the same amount of a common something exists in two different things, 8 bushels of wheat and 100 pounds of iron. These two things are thus equal to a third, the something that in and for itself is neither the one nor the other. Each, insofar as it is an exchange value, must be reducible to that something. A simple geometric example will illustrate the point. In order to establish and compare the surface areas of rectilinear figures, we draw them as triangles, then reduce the triangles to an expression very different from their visible shapes, 1/2 the base times the height. The exchange values of commodities are likewise reduced to a common something which they represent in greater or smaller amounts. This common something can't be a geometrical, physical, or chemical property, or any of a commodity's natural properties. The physical properties of commodities matter only insofar as they make commodities useful and thus into use values. But what characterizes the exchange relation of commodities is clearly that it involves abstracting from their use values. Within this relation, one use value counts for exactly as much as any other, given the right proportion. Or as old Barbon says, one sort of wares are as good as another if the value be equal. There's no difference or distinction in things of equal value. As use values, commodities differ above all with respect to quality. As exchange values, they can differ only with respect to quantity, and they contain not even an atom of use value. If we set aside the use value belonging to the physical bodies of commodities, just one quality remains. They're products of labor. But the product of labor, too, has been transformed in our hands. If we abstract from its use value, we will be abstracting also from the physical components and forms that made it into a use value in the first place. The product of labor is no longer a table, house, spool of yarn, or any other useful thing. All its sensuous components are wiped away. Neither is it any longer the work of carpentry, construction, weaving, or some other particular kind of productive labor. When the useful character of labor products disappears, so too does the useful character of the instances of labor represented in them. What happens in effect is that the different concrete forms of those instances of labor vanish as well. They can be no longer distinguished from one another and have all been reduced to the same human labor, that is, abstract human labor. Now let's consider what remains of these labor products. Nothing of them is left over except the same ghostly objecthood, a bare gelatinous blob of undifferentiated human labor, of human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All that these things still represent is this: when they were made, human labor power was expended, human labor accumulated. As crystallized pieces of a social substance, which they consist of collectively, they are values. The exchange value of commodities presented itself to us as their exchange relations as something fully independent of commodities' use values. If we now abstract from the use value of labor products, we will arrive at their value as it was defined above. The common something expressed by the commodities exchange relations or exchange value is, in fact, their value. The course of this examination will eventually bring us back to the notion of exchange value as value's necessary mode of expression or form of appearance. First, however, we need to consider value without taking that form into account. A use value or good has value only because abstract human labor is objectified or materialized in it. How should the magnitude of its value be measured? By the amount of value-creating substance it contains, labor. The amount of labor is measured by its duration and labor time has its own standard of measurement in definite units of time, such as hours, days, and so on. Now, we might be tempted to think that since the amount of labor expended to produce a commodity determines its value, the lazier or more incompetent the person producing it, the more valuable the commodity will be. After all, it will take longer to produce it. But the labor that constitutes the substance of values is equal human labor, the expenditure of the self-same human labor power. All the labor power represented in the values of the commodity world, the sum of the society's labor power represented in them, counts for something here as one and the same human labor power, even though labor power belonging to innumerable different individual people goes into it. Each person's labor power is the same human labor power as any other person's, insofar as it has the characteristic of being socially average labor power and functions as such socially average labor power, which means that it requires only the labor time necessary on average, the labor time socially necessary to produce a given commodity. Socially necessary labor time is the labor time needed to produce a given use value under society's normal conditions of production, using labor that has an average level of skill and intensity. When the power loom was introduced in England, the labor needed to turn a given quantity of yarn into fabric likely fell to half of what it had been. The English hand weaver had to expend as much labor time as ever to transform the same amount of material, but now the product of his individual labor hour represented only half a social labor hour, and thus its value dropped half. It is solely the quantity of socially necessary labor, or the socially necessary labor time, that goes into making a use value that determines its magnitude of value. Here, each individual commodity counts for something only as an average instance of its type. Commodities that contain equal amounts of labor, in other words, commodities that can be produced in the same amount of labor time, will therefore have the same magnitude of value. A commodity's value has the same relation to the value of every other commodity that the labor time required to produce it has to the labor time required to produce every other commodity. As values, all commodities are nothing but discrete masses of coagulated labor time. A commodity's magnitude of value will not vary then as long as the amount of labor time needed to make it remains constant. But the labor time it takes to produce a commodity varies whenever labor's productive power does. So therefore, a number of factors determine labor's productive power, including workers' average skill level, how far scientific knowledge and its technological applications have developed, the social organization of the production process, the scope and efficiency of the means of production, and conditions in nature. The same quantity of labor that is represented in 8 bushels of wheat during a good harvest might, for example, be represented in only 4 bushels during a bad one. The same quantity of labor will extract more metal from rich mines than poor ones, and so on. Diamonds are hard to find in the Earth's crust. Discovering them thus requires, on average, a lot of labor time. And from this, it follows that much labor is represented in small quantity of diamonds. Jacob doubts that the price of gold has ever corresponded to its full value. That is even truer of diamonds. In 1823, according to Eschwege, the spoils from Brazilian diamond mines over the previous 80 years didn't equal the total price of 1.5 years of the country's average sugar or coffee production, even though the diamonds represented far more labor and thus more value. Applied to more bountiful mines, the same quantity of labor would be represented in a larger number of diamonds, and the diamond's value would fall. If we could easily turn coal into diamonds, their value would drop below that of plain bricks. In general, the greater labor's productive power, the smaller the amount of labor time needed to make a good. And the smaller the amount of labor crystallized in a good, the smaller the value, its value. The reverse is also true. the less productive power labor has, the greater the labor time needed to produce a product, and in turn, the greater a product's value. A commodity's magnitude of value varies directly with the amount of labor realized in it and inversely with that labor's productive power. A thing can be a use value without being a value, big V value. This happens when labor doesn't mediate a thing's usefulness for human beings, as with air, virgin soil, naturally occurring meadows and trees, and so on. A thing can be also both useful and a product of human labor without being a commodity. Anyone who satisfies one of his or her own wants or needs with something they've produced has made a use value, not a commodity. Because to produce a commodity is to produce not only a use value, but also a social use value, that is, a use value for others. Finally, nothing can be a value without being a use value. The thing is useless, and so is the labor it contains. The labor doesn't count as labor, and there thus generates no value. Now, that's all pretty rigid there, and of course, I'm not sure whether that's any easier to read than the original. It's slightly easier, but I leave it to you to sort of look at it, and we may even do a comparison of various portions of the text. And mainly because the first chapter, as we pointed out before, is the first chapter is the one that gets a lot of attention, such that full books have been written just about the first chapter of Capital, and we're not even at the end, where we're talking about value, form, and a bunch of other things. So it's densely packed with lots of stuff. And needless to say, there are several books that plow through this at various levels of intensity. Now, on to this is the text, and it's available from the Class Unity website. There's a copy uploaded into the Discord, and that is that the Great Financial Crisis: Causes and Consequences, written by John Bellencoster and Fred Magdoff. And I include the table of contents, noting that these are the things that the Class Unity folks are discussing, and not everyone is able to read the whole darn thing. It's not that long, but it does have, it's got 6 chapters, etc. So this is the preface. And for those who haven't looked at it, you might remind yourself of what this is about, because it was produced pretty much during the time when there was the major financial crises. And of course, the onset of the Obama administration, which was sort of not unlike the Trump administration giving a kind of fait accompli to the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the re-emergence or the return of the Taliban. It's not that different in that sense. In the profusion of commentaries on the reversals of the U.S. and world economies written over the last few months, this is in 2008, perhaps none was more pertinent than the report issued by the U.S. satirical magazine The Onion on July 14th, 2008, headlined "Recession-Plagued Nation Demands New Bubble to Invest in." As The Onion playfully told its readers, the U.S. economy cannot survive on sound investments alone. Demand for a new investment bubble began months ago when the subprime mortgage bubble burst and left the business world without a suitable source of pretend income. But as more and more time has passed with no substitute bubble forthcoming, investors have begun to fear that the worst case scenario, an outcome known among economists as real-world repercussions, may be inevitable. Mockingly raising the question of whether the economy would sink without another financial bubble, The Onion cited a make-believe investor. "America needs another bubble," said Chicago investor Bob Tiken. "At this point, bubbles are the only thing keeping us afloat." Indeed, in its own ironic way, The Onion hit on the crucial problem of modern monopoly-financed capital, the stagnation of production and the growth of financial bubbles in response, the bursting of which takes us back to where we began, real-world repercussions. This is the story told in this book. The names with which we choose to represent climactic world historical events are important. The Great Depression of the 1930s, as distinguished from most other economic disruptions in the history of capitalism, have never ceased to be written in capital letters. Today, in the midst of the worst financial crisis and leading perhaps to the worst economic crisis generally since the Great Depression, some have already referred to it as the Great Financial Crisis, the GFC. Like the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression 80 years ago, it represents a turning point in economic history, the full ramifications of which are not yet clear, and indeed depend on the concrete actions people take in response to the crisis. Our purpose here is to examine the causes and consequences of the present great financial crisis and the radical changes in society that might be undertaken in response if the great mass of the population decide that economics is really political economy and hence theirs to choose. Even more than most works, this book is case of standing on the shoulders of giants who are themselves standing on the shoulders of giants. It is built, as we explain in the following pages, on a foundation laid by Paul Baran, Paul Sweezy, and Harry Magdoff, who in turn relied in various ways on the prior work of Marx, Veblen, Schumpeter, Keynes, Kalecki, Stendhal, and Minsky. Do not therefore claim any particular originality for ourselves in this work. Rather, it is continuation and application of current historical developments of an analysis that has evolved over many years and constitutes an attempt to use this to help ordinary people understand the need for radical change through mass action. We hope that some of those who will find this analysis of the great financial crisis useful will be encouraged to seek the longer and deeper analysis of these developments in Baran, Sweezy, and Magdoff, all the way back to Marx. The core of the Great Financial Crisis was published first in Monthly Review and reflects many years of collaboration in the magazine, which has sought since 1949 to keep an independent socialist voice and a critical perspective alive within the United States. Introduction. Joseph Schumpeter, 1939. History is a record of effects, the vast majority of which nobody intended to produce. The Great Financial Crisis began somewhat inconspicuously in late summer of 2007 with the failure of two Bear Stearns hedge funds, and then went from bad to worse over the following year, despite countless attempts by governments to halt its progress. It is now universally recognized as the worst economic crash since the Great Depression. Indeed, as U.S. economist and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman indicated in late 2008, it raises the prospect of a second Great Depression. Although former Federal Reserve Board Chairman Alan Greenspan has likened it to a once-in-a-century credit tsunami, the Great Financial Crisis is a historical rather than a natural phenomenon. It represents a development both familiar in the history of capitalism and in many ways historically unprecedented. It was preceded by a whole series of lesser economic shocks of growing magnitude over the last 2 decades, most notably the U.S. stock market crash of 1987, the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s and early 90s, the Japanese financial crisis and great stagnation of the 1990s, the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 98, and the new economy that is the dot-com crash of 2000. Yet the great financial crisis has far outreached them all. Both the U.S. economy and the economy of the world as a whole are in a state of deep decline, facing what is likely to be a prolonged stagnation. Now, why is this happening? Are there reasonable grounds to hope that the new administration in Washington with the election of Barack Obama will be able to reverse the course of the economic decline? For meaningful answers to this question, it is necessary to have historical perspective going back to the 1930s. Already at the time of the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes, the foremost economist of the 20th century, argued that capitalism might return to growth and profitability without a return to full employment. As John Kenneth Galbraith stated in The Age of Uncertainty, Keynes's basic conclusion can be put very directly. Previously, it had been held that the economic system, any capitalist system, found its equilibrium at full employment. Left to itself, it was thus that it came to rest. Keynes showed that the modern economy could as well find its equilibrium with continuing serious underemployment. Its perfectly normal tendency was to what economists have since come to call an underemployment equilibrium. The point of this, of course, is Keynes is talking about a bunch of other things that are going on at the same time that have to do with fiscal activity, certain ways in which we think about the acceleration, the multiplication of certain types of investments, the role of liquidity in all of this. It looks at it in a variety of ways that take exception to the idea that in a classical economy, everything should sort of even out. It never does when you look at actual reality. It was this framework that induced Keynes's leading U.S. follower, Alvin Hansen, to raise the question in 1938 of full recovery or stagnation in a book with that title. Capitalism, in this view, did not inherently follow a path of full employment and rapid growth, but could be stuck for decades, even permanently, in a condition of slow growth, high unemployment, underemployment, and excess capacity or stagnation. In his 1936 classic, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and in other works written at the time of the Depression, Keynes raised the question of a number of flaws internal to the accumulation, that is, the savings and investment process under capitalism. His most crucial arguments related to factors leading to a slowdown in investment. For a capitalist economy to work well, the surplus or savings that it generates must be invested in new productive capacity. Yet, investment in modern capitalism, Keynes argued, was at best a risky undertaking, since investment decisions that determine the level of output in the present are based on expectations of profits on this investment a number of years, perhaps as much as a decade in the future. So it's all about expectations. Under these circumstances, dominated by uncertainty, investment shortfalls can result from any number of factors, including the building up of overcapacity in plant equipment, a sense that the market for consumer goods is or soon will be saturated, a perception that the external frontier for expansion is limited, etc. High levels of inequality holding down the relative purchasing power of the working class can weaken consumption and hence the expected profits on new investment. Any lessening of investment tends to generate a vicious circle, pulling down employment, income, and spending, generating growing financial problems, and negatively affecting the business climate generally, resulting in an economic slowdown and further investment decline. So you can see there's cyclical arguments in here, but what Keynes identifies is there's certain flaws in sort of drawing it out, and it's sort of been the business of various macroeconomists for the last many decades of showing how mathematically this might actually occur or has occurred. And of course, there's a gap between reality and our theoretical approach to it. It was this analysis of internal contradiction of the capitalist investment process that most strongly influenced the early, more critical Keynesian analyses. The reception of Keynes's general theory in the United States was strongly affected by the recession of 1937, when the U.S. economy experienced a sharp downturn, with unemployment suddenly rising from 14 to 19%, far short of a full recovery from the Depression. With around 20% of the workforce unemployed nearly a decade after the 1929 stock market crash, economists were faced with the specter of continuing economic stagnation. Departing from the timeless mechanical models that dominated orthodox economics, Alvin Hansen, emphasized the long-term implications of Keynes's thinking, presenting what was called the stagnation thesis. Hansen focused on the specific historical forces that had propelled the capitalist economy, allowing it to reach a high rate of growth for a period. As historical forces, these were transitory and waned over time. Moreover, a tendency to secular stagnation could be attributed in part to the emergence of maturity in capitalist economies. The main components of industry had been built up from scratch in the early phases of industrialization. Investment, therefore, became increasingly geared to mere replacement, albeit with more efficient plant and equipment, with little new net investment. The result was what Joseph Schumpeter, in a polemic against Hansen, characterized as a theory of vanishing investment opportunities, a term Hansen himself accepted. In a 1954 review of Joseph Stendel's Maturity and Stagnation in American Capitalism, Hansen wrote that unless fairly drastic action is taken, there is a serious danger that we may move sideways in the United States or even slip down gradually over the next few years. Measured against the attainable growth of GNP, of which we are capable, such an experience would indeed be a form of stagnation. Now, the Polish Marxist economist Michael Kalecki, often characterized as the most important thinker associated with the Keynesian revolution after Keynes, who had developed the main breakthroughs even before Keynes himself, summed up the essential problem succinctly. Our analysis shows that long-run development is not inherent in the capitalist economy. Thus, specific development factors are required to sustain a long-run upward movement. During the prosperous years of the 1950s and 60s, later referred to as the golden age of the post-Second World War economy, concerns about stagnation largely disappeared from establishing economics. But, this is that issue that it was the golden age, the product of, what was it the product of? It was the product of overproduction and then nationally planned economies and war or whatever. Keynes's discoveries were tamed and reinserted into the pre-Keynesian neoclassical analysis, producing what came to be known as the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, dubbed bastard Keynesianism by Keynes's younger colleague, Joan Robinson. Such was the confidence of orthodox economists in this period that Paul Samuelson, a leading figure in the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, wrote in 1964 that the ghost of Thomas Carlyle should be believed to know that economics, after all, has not been a dismal science. This is where the cliche comes from, economics, the dismal science. It has been the cheerful but impatient science of growth. That is, Carlyle talks about this dismal science, and Samuelson's making sort of a joke about it. Yet, some radical Keynesian and Marxist economists, defying the dominant view of the times, continued to raise the question of stagnation, arguing that it may remain the core problem of the monopoly capitalist economy, and that the prosperity of the 1960s was dependent on short-term stimuli that could not be sustained. The best-known work to make this argument explicitly in the 1960s was Paul Moran and Paul Sweezy's 1966 book, Monopoly Capital, which argued that the normal state of the monopoly capitalist economy is stagnation. Moran and Sweezy were Marxist economists, Sweezy at Harvard, Moran at Stanford. Both were strongly influenced by Keynes and even more by Kalecki, as well as Marx, Veblen, and Schumpeter. The problem, as they explained it, was that the enormous productivity of the monopoly capitalist economy, coupled with oligopolistic pricing, generated a huge and growing surplus. This is the overproduction thesis, which went beyond the capacity of the economy to absorb it through the normal channels of consumption and investment. Effective demand remained insufficient even when civilian government spending, which was politically constrained under monopoly capital because of opposition to its intrusion in the sphere of private profits, was added in. The system, therefore, became dependent on the generation of larger and larger amounts of waste in the form of military spending, the expansion of the sales effort, speculative finance, etc., which functioned as external stimulants boosting production. All of these stimulants, however, were bound to prove inadequate to support the economy over time, since bigger and bigger injections were needed just to keep it going. Within a few years of their book's publication, a renewed crisis set in, and the growth rates of the U.S. and other advanced capitalist economies slowed, leading to a dramatic departure from the growth rates of the 1950s and 60s. The golden age prosperity turned first, in the colorful language of Joan Robinson, into a limping golden age, and then into a leaden age. This slowdown or stagnation has now persisted for 4 decades and has only gotten worse over time. At each recovery from a mild recession, as Robinson wrote of the stagnation exhibited by U.S. capitalism, the gap between the best realized performance and the potential grows larger. If the problem of investment, as articulated by thinkers like Keynes, Kalecki, Hansen, Brand, Sweezy, and Robinson, led to the development of stagnation theory, there was also a second minor aspect of Keynes's critique of investment that had closely related adverse implications for the future of capital accumulation. But that was scarcely perceived even by critical economic thinkers before the 1970s. This had to do with a contradictory role of finance in a capitalist economy, which Keynes had raised in responding to the 1929 stock market crash. The development of the modern corporation was inseparable from the development of modern finance, including the market for industrial securities and the enhanced role given to credit debt throughout the economy. The stock market itself the stock market itself, Keynes suggested, was primarily a product of the attempts of investors to reduce their risks associated with the investment in production through the holding of paper claims to wealth that were more easily transferable. But once this happened, capitalism increasingly took on a dual aspect reflected in 2 different pricing structures. That is, the pricing of physical output on the one hand, and the pricing of financial assets. Each operated separately. If long-term assets of corporations were turned into short-term financial commitments for investors, the possibility arose, Keynes argued, that the economy would be hostage more and more to speculation over the paper claims to wealth, generating high volatility and instability. As he put it, during the early days of the Great Depression, there's a multitude of real assets in the world which constitute our capital wealth buildings, stocks of commodities, goods, and courts of manufacture and of transport, and so forth. The nominal owners of these assets, however, not infrequently borrowed money in order to become possessed of them. To a corresponding extent, the actual owners of wealth have claims not on real assets, but on money. A considerable part of this financing takes place through the banking system, which interposes its guarantee between its depositors who lend it money and its borrowing customers to whom it loans money, herewith to finance the purchase of real assets. The interposition of this veil of money, the money veil, this is very important, between the real asset and the wealth owner is a specially marked characteristic of the modern world. The idea of the money veil is sort of a BFD for, thinking, well, why does this happen? Not everybody knows. You don't have a kind of perfect information. It's not perfectly transparent. And in some ways it should be. Now, one of the promises of digital processes is that we might actually have more transparency, but we really don't, because there's always something that gets in the way. For Keynes, the structure of modern finance invited a periodic decoupling of the market for assets from production and the possibility that speculative bubbles followed by their inevitable bursting could destabilize the whole system. All this was made worse as a result of the veil of money and the fact that the banking system tended to be dragged into the center of the maelstrom. As he said in a now frequently quoted passage from The General Theory, speculators may do no harm as bubbles on a steady stream of enterprise, but the position is serious when enterprise becomes the bubble on a whirlpool of speculation. Credit for the rediscovery and development of Keynes's insights on finance goes mainly to Hyman Minsky, longtime professor of economics at WashU, who developed a financial instability hypothesis. We've looked at that before. Beginning in the 1960s, Minsky was a socialist-oriented economist who had been deeply influenced by the work of Keynes, Kalecki, and Hansen. His financial instability hypothesis argued that the financial structure of the advanced capitalist economy exhibits an internal flaw, driving it relentlessly from robustness to fragility, making the whole economy susceptible, in the end, to debt deflations of the kind exhibited in the Great Depression. For Minsky, the Achilles heel of a developed financial system was that it was dependent on a constant cash flow of income, in particular profits, to support and validate its continued expansion. Over time, the instability of the financial system increased with debt piled on debt in a bubble only waiting to burst when the infusion of cash from income inevitably flowed. The modern economy, therefore, became chronically dependent on the lender of last resort function of government headquartered in the central banks and treasury departments of the major states, which were charged with propping up the financial structure and avoiding a major debt deflation by supplying liquidity in a crisis. Now, when he says states here, this means nations. And this in turn required the government, able through the scale of its own economic involvement, to stave off a financial crisis by large monetary infusions acting as lender of last resort, print money. Minsky's conclusion was stark. Capitalism is a flawed system in that if its development is not constrained, it will lead to periodic deep depressions and the perpetuation of poverty. This is the underlying sort of argument that is somewhat suggested in terms of intergenerational wealth that Piketty is sort of fiddling around with. Capitalism, Minsky claimed, did not necessarily lead to deep depressions, but there was a continuing race between the increasing scale and fragility of the financial system and the growth of the lender of last resort function. A major concern was that the government, as the lender of last resort, would not be able to keep up with ballooning financial markets unless some restraints were imposed on the latter. The very nature of speculative growth, however, demanded the removal of all such restraints at every sign of crisis if the bubble were not to burst. Besides Minsky, other dissonant economists also focused on the financial instability of capitalism. By far the most persistent and penetrating thinkers in this respect from the 1960s to the 90s were, Harry Magdoff and Paul Sweezy, who stressed in one article after another the interrelationship between stagnation and what later came to be known as financialization. That is the shift in gravity of the economy from production to finance. And yes, this is mirrored in volume 3 of Capital in the difference between the production sector and, merchant capital, financial capital, et cetera. So Department 1, Department 2 sort of stuff. Magdoff, a former New Deal economist at one time responsible for overseeing the publication of the Bureau of Economic Analysis's monthly survey, the monthly survey of current business, raised the issue as early as 1965 of the long-term increase in debt in relation to the underlying economy as a possible destabilizing trend. In the following decades, Magdoff and Sweezy, writing in Monthly Review, tracked this aspect of monopoly capitalism empirically year after year and sometimes month by month. What was missing from Minsky's financial instability theory, Magdoff and Sweezy argued, was the explicit recognition of re-emerging stagnation, already evident by the mid-1960s and gaining strength in the 1970s. This set the conditions for a major change in the role of the financial sector in U.S. capitalism. Rather than being a modest helper to the capital accumulation process, it gradually turned into a driving force. Speculative finance became a kind of secondary engine for growth, given the weakness in the primary engine, that is productive investment. So, you sort of are always looking for speculators, and speculators are a wild bunch, as it were. This sort of cowboy or piracy sort of model is at work. The result was an acceleration of the process of debt buildup, going beyond mere speculative orgies that historically came at the peak of business cycles, becoming instead a permanent, institutionalized feature of the economy. The search by capital for profitable outlets for its surplus, despite the stagnation of investment opportunities within production, coupled with the belief that asset prices as a whole went only one way up, generated a secular financial explosion. The system became more and more dependent on a series of financial bubbles to keep it going, each one bigger than the last. The specter of a major devaluation of capital loomed over ever larger as a result of these developments, while the financial explosion, together with other such stimuli, such as military spending, the sales effort, et cetera, was, despite its stratospheric rise, particularly in the dominant economies, unable to prevent a process of creeping stagnation from taking over. For Magdoff and Sweezy, the essence of capitalism's dilemma in its monopoly stage was captured by the symbiotic embrace that had emerged between stagnation and financialization. The economy could not live without financialization, along with other props to the system, such as military spending, and it could not, in the end, live with it. Our argument in this book, derived from Magdoff and Sweezy in particular, is that a realistic assessment of recent economic history is best conducted within a framework that focuses on the interrelationship between the stagnation tendency of monopoly capital and the forces that to some extent counter it. The largest of the countervailing forces during the last 3 decades is financialization. So much so that we can speak today of monopoly-finance capital, the expansion of debt and speculation that characterized the U.S. economy and advanced capitalism as a whole since the late 1960s, represented the main means by which the system managed to avoid sinking into a deep slump while not enabling it to overcome the underlying stagnation tendency. Hence, it is in this complex dynamic that answers to the present economic predicament are to be found. This is illustrated in chart 1, showing by means of a time series index a decline in the rate of goods production as a percentage of GDP in the economy and a rise at the same time as debt as a percentage of GDP. Not only do the changes in debt and goods production as percentages of GDP head off in opposite directions, but the gap rapidly widens. 2 things should be underscored here. First, financialization manifests in the growth of debt relative to GDP has been a long-term trend that accelerated beginning in the 1980s. The debt overhang in this period is therefore not simply a short-lived phenomenon occurring at the end of a business cycle peak, as in the case of most speculative booms historically. Second, the stagnation of goods production relative to GDP has worsened over time, despite the enormous economic lift provided by the financial explosion. There is a temptation of some analysts, particularly on the left, to see finance as simply a parasitic phenomenon, and that all could be put right simply by rechanneling those funds to productive investment. However, the argument presented in this book, as the foregoing suggests, and this you can see the debt as percentage of GDP rising and the total goods production diverging as a percentage of GDP, and this is from 1960 to 2003, suggests is different. The financial explosion in the U.S. and other advanced capitalist economies since the 1960s, we argue, that is Magdoff and Bellamy Foster, is symptomatic of the underlying stagnation tendency that has its roots in the whole pattern of accumulation under monopoly finance capital. It is this and not the financialization or even today's crisis of financialization that's the real problem. Marx explained that capital was invariably overextended in a boom, and then in the crisis that followed, a part of this capital was devalued, enabling the rest to return to profitability in the process of accumulation expansion. Crises thus resulted from the overproduction of capital. Indeed, the real barrier of capitalist production, Marx wrote, is capital itself. The system is now hard up against this barrier in multiple ways. There's no possibility that the enormous surplus capital that has fed the financial explosion can be absorbed by productive investment under the present system at this stage in its history and with the existing structure of inequality. At the same time, the financialization process itself is now in crisis. The most likely prospect, therefore, is a prolonged, deep stagnation. All of this is necessary background to the story told in this book. In what follows, the great financial crisis is addressed chronologically, with the chapters consisting of analyses originally written as parts of a running commentary during the years 2006-2008 as the present crisis took shape. We have purposely kept the first 5 chapters unchanged, leaving them in the form in which they were originally published, with only minor copy editing changes to reflect the concrete application of the stagnation financialization perspective to the crisis at each stage of its development. The 6th chapter, along with this introduction, was written especially for this book. Part 1 on historical causes proceeds from a consideration of the household debt bubble, chapter 1, to the wider explosion of debt and speculation, chapter 2, to the emergence of monopoly finance capital, chapter 3, and finally to the larger problem of the financialization of capital, chapter 4. Part 2 on consequences or the actual playing out of the crisis and its long-term implications begins with the crisis of financialization and the onset of the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis, that's chapter 5, proceeding to a treatment of the full financial implosion as 2009 approached, that is chapter 6. We end the final chapter with a consideration of the larger political economic aspects of the crisis. A self-imposed limitation of our analysis here is its focus almost exclusively on the development of the global financial crisis in the context of the U.S. economy, addressing only tangentially the other advanced capitalist economies, the emerging economies, the underdeveloped economies, and the world economy as a whole. We also refrain from examining in any detail the U.S. current account deficit or the role of the dollar as a surrogate world currency. Needless to say, these are all important parts of the overall story. Our decision to impose these limits is based on our conviction that the main contradictions of capitalism are still best perceived, as Marx emphasized in the 19th century, from the standpoint of the preeminent capitalist economy at a given stage of its development. In the 19th century, Britain. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the United States. This is kind of the imperialism, the Leninist model or the Hobson model. Moreover, the United States is without a doubt the principal source of the current economic firestorm. Finally, the global ramifications of the great financial crisis need to be understood in the first instance in the context of the waning political, economic, and military hegemony of the United States. We hope that our focus on the U.S. economy shall prove to be a useful contribution to the wider story that still remains to be told. Needless to say, globalization and the anti-capitalism related to it it's important. Ultimately, we believe that the great financial crisis, GFC, raises questions that are primarily political rather than economic. Many naturally hope that the new administration in Washington, with the election of Barack Obama, will provide an opportunity to carry out major changes to overcome this crisis and its worst effects by ushering in a new Deal. Well, that chance, it didn't happen. The question thus arises, is it possible to create a new Deal on the scale of the late 1930s in Roosevelt's second administration, or to go even further in promoting civilian government spending and progressive social change? As John Kenneth Galbraith wrote in 2004 in his Economics of Innocent Fraud, the one wholly reliable remedy for recession is a solid flow of consumer demand. Failure in such a flow is recession. This is what looms in the present moment. In the United States, especially with stagnation and recession, the lower income citizen has an acute need for education, healthcare, or basic family income in one form or another. Would a concerted spending program devoted to these ends bring the crisis to an end? Our answer to this is complex, and in this introduction must be necessarily brief. First, it's essential to note that what pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression of the 1930s was not civilian government spending in the New Deal. 1 out of 5 workers was still unemployed in 1938, but rather the enormous expansion of military spending with the coming of the Second World War, beginning in 1939. Under the stimulus of wartime demand, the U.S. economy increased in size by 70% in only 6 years. However, with U.S. military expenditures today constituting almost half of total world military spending, U.S. military expenditures in 2007 were officially over $550 billion a year, but in reality, $1 trillion a year. So we're up to more closely $2 trillion, all of which is geared to maintaining the greatest empire the world has ever seen, et cetera, et cetera. It is obvious that this war machine needs to be drastically cut, not expanded. The way out of the Great Depression cannot be duplicated without threatening world annihilation. Indeed, any program for social progress emanating in the United States that did not begin by seeking to dismantle the U.S. empire would be a travesty from the start. Second, given the existing power relations in the United States, any endeavor to replicate the New Deal, RVJK, is unlikely to gain much traction. In the current rules of the game, it would be hamstrung from the start by entrenched vested interests. This is not to deny, of course, that such a New Deal, if it were carried out in a radical spirit, as represented, for example, by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, in the late 1930s, could do much to help the general population in the context of the crisis, reducing some inequities, but it would likely soon succumb to its own and capitalism's contradiction. Nevertheless, if such a movement for radical reform were actually tried and yet failed, we think inevitably to remove the injustices and irrationalities of the system, there would be no need to go back to square one. Rather, the population would be fully justified in such a case in pushing forward and concluding that the entire political economic structure should be replaced brick by brick with another that would meet their genuine needs and be under their democratic control, a system of social use rather than private gain. Already, peoples throughout the world have reached this conclusion that the only rational answer is to replace the current rotten system with a more humane order geared to collective needs. For centuries, the friends and enemies of social progress have called this alternative of a people-directed economy and society socialism. We can think of no better name. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I've gone excessively over, but actually I went for a full hour. And let's see if you have comments or brickbats or whatever. Yes, indeed. Miners were making far less than a living wage, even in terms of, and yes, piecework rather than time spent. Yes, there's all kinds of different models for such. Needless to say, the smuggling out of diamonds, the entire sub-market, informal market for diamonds is another issue as well. No different than the mining of gold and all of the resources in Africa in that particular context. And yes, it is interesting to view the war economy as a planned economy. It clearly is a planned economy. It's national planning of a type. And if you look at the history of how, well, first of all, Lend-Lease was the front end of that. And then you go to, actual national planning, and then, of course, national rationing during the same period. In the American context, that's all there as well. Needless to say, it doesn't always work that way. Yes, a less licentious word than coagulated. The coagulation deal is still important. Let's see. Other questions? Okay. Yes, I will cut this in a moment if there are not any other issues. Comments? Brickbats? Interventions? I added Anwar Sheikh's interview here for some parts of it to just give you a sense that this is still working through some of these basic questions are actually important relative to the economy, and it's not as complicated as we think. It's just simply from an institutionalist point of view, I think the economy can be tweaked in a way that can make a lot of these adjustments. And lest you think this is unimportant, at the current moment, there's always looming stagflation. That it was looming at the end of the Trump administration. There was a big problem there, and you could see that coming up through the budget, the defaults, the American economy defaults that came around budget time. Similarly, it could come up again, as I pointed out in another instance. It could come up, and if no one's paying attention, the Treasury is, so it's probably not going to be a big deal. But it is coming up at exactly the same time as if we get another January 6th type insurrection. So there could be lots of chaos, lots more chaos than you think going on at the exact same time, in terms of defaulting on stuff. And yes, the interest rate may be dropped soon. Powell has said so much today, but the fact is there are recessions in England and in Japan at the current moment. There may be, if you really want to start measuring it, the recessions of a type in various other smaller countries' economies. And of course, there's Latin America, which always seems to be a mess. And it's a mess for a variety of, well, somewhat interesting reasons. So there's that. And of course, we have several wars going on at the same time. No other comments or questions?
Well, if I'm lucky, there'll be a recession. It's going to be a really big recession. It'll remind people of just how great it was when gas was only $25. How great it was. Yes, I think there'll be a recession. It's going to be huge.
The biggest
The only
one.
way to avoid it is to vote for me.
The biggest one you've ever seen.
Huge.
Huge.
So when I came in late, when was this written that we just read?
2008.
All right, so right at the height of it.
Right at the height. Yeah, right at the moment. As if to remind people it's really bad, but things can be done. And but unfortunately, the Obama administration did a different thing. It didn't do a bad thing necessarily in terms of saving the U.S. economy.
No.
But it didn't do what it really should have done, and it could have done. It could have done. See, that's the weirder thing about it, and unfortunately, as I've tried to be an apologist for it, but I think Obama knew that because he was the first black guy, that he couldn't go all hog wild, and he had far too many other rich guys, Warren Buffett, blah blah blah, all capturing his attention. It's really unfortunate. But
no, it is.
It
here's the thing. I can be the first black president, but I can't piss off Wall Street. I just can't do it.
Yep. That's pretty much it. And of course they rewarded him for that, whatever that means.
They certainly did.
But damn it. Now the thing that I think that Trump is trying to throw at us is that a Harris administration will be the one that moves us to try and make some of these changes, because it's a lot more obvious. And she's on the one hand the first woman, but the second black, so it's second person of color. So things can happen. But of course, she's been actually captured by all those Biden centrists that were left over from, Obama, Biden. So they're all still there. I just, even seeing, Hillary Clinton at the convention, brings a shudder. I mean, it's fine, whatever. You've got to recognize, you got to represent and all that stuff. And of course, there was Bill, but, that history has what screwed up some of the economy and put us actually in a bad situation. So whatever.
Yep. Well, there was a third way. I pursued the third way. The politics at that time would not have allowed me to take a more leftist approach. Remember, liberal, back when I was a president, liberal was a dirty word.
Oh, man. The third way, Democratic Leadership Council. God.
The DLC. You may poo-poo the DLC, but we brought the economy. We brought the economy. We recovered. I feel your pain. I felt their pain. I felt a lot of other things, a lot of other people too, but I felt their pain.
Yeah, the fact is, he who was his consultant? The guy who sucked on women's feet what the hell was his
Oh,
name?
gross.
Dick,
Right, him.
Dick Morris.
God, what was his name?
Dick
Dick
Morris.
Morris. Oh yeah. Oof,
But he did suck
creepy,
on women's feet. I don't know. That's just
creepy
something.
dude.
Uh,
He was an interesting character, Dick. Yeah, we had a lot of conversations together. A lot
indeed.
of late night talks.
Tootsies, Tootsies. All righty. We're getting thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. Um, I think we're close to the end of our fiddling around with these stories, and we can go to a more general conversation and be much more profane. We'll do that in a moment as I search for, come on, search for the live stream shut off,
Oh
which
yeah.
I'm hoping we'll have more, more of this tomorrow. I'm gonna do a little bit more of the probably the Bellamy Foster Magdoff thing, but I'm also going to introduce some other stuff, and mainly because this is consonant with the class unity folks who have devoted 2 weeks essentially to chapters from the Bellamy Foster Magdoff book, and which they were discussing last week, and I think we'll be discussing this week this coming week as well. I'm not quite sure, and so that's coming up. So stay tuned. We do Dis and Dat every weekday at 5, and at 3 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday we do weekly marks. And at some moment, the class unity Zoom will be over, and we'll be back probably to doing something more weekly marks like at that time, which is 5 or 6 weeks away.